4 generations, families in the depths of the United States lived on society's sidelines, preserving a legacy of consanguinity that deformed and destroyed its own strains. Hidden in the shadows of the story, far from the public eye, incest cases and their genetic consequences were never fully revealed. The obscure secrets of families whose stories were silenced and distorted over time are revealed in this documentary. We will explore the real cases of families whose lineages were devastated by generations of marriages between relatives, leading to physical deformities, diseases, and a stigma that echoes to this day. More than only the story of a forbidden act is shown by what these families faced and the impact their choices had for the following generations, the consequences of guarded secrets and how they changed the fate of many are revealed. While we go to the region of the Appalachians where the history of the Kellogg family began, hidden from public view and ignored for many years, the camera focuses on old images with the vision of isolated villages and faces that carry the scars of the past. Check it out if you are already subscribed to this channel so as not to lose more rare and impactful stories that are carefully hidden from the public eye. The history of the Kellogg family began in a remote region of the Appalachians where the outside world seemed distant and the possibilities of marriages outside the community were practically non-existent. A closed cycle was created by geographical and social limitations at that time, where marriages between relatives were often the only options. A devastating legacy of consanguinity that would forever mark the following generations would soon become what began as a seemingly innocent and common practice. Members of the Kellogg family were known for their simple experience focused on basic survival needs in the early years of the 19th century in an isolated area of West Virginia. Formed by few families who knew each other very well and depended on each other for support was the community, located in the mountains of Appalachia. The idea of marriage outside the community was practically unthinkable, and there was no easy access to other villages or cities. According to local records, the first marriage within the Kellogg family itself occurred around 1820 when Ezekiel Kellogg, a young family member, married his cousin Sarah Kellogg, who like him came from the same small community. A practical solution was seen in the marriage. The options outside the community were minimal, and due to isolation, the idea of preserving the lineage in the family was considered normal. This kind of union between cousins repeated itself over the years, perpetuating the practice within the family itself. A combination of factors motivated the first act of family incest: the isolation, the scarcity of new people in the region, and a particular view of the preservation of the family lineage. A shared decision among family members who saw this as a way to strengthen family ties and ensure the continuity of family business and land, it was not a case of forcing. The choices were made for social and economic convenience without real knowledge about the genetic effects. James Kellogg was born in 1821, the first child of the union after the marriage of Ezekiel and Sarah. Physical characteristics that immediately caused strangeness in the community were presented by James. He had facial deformities, motor difficulties, and a delay in cognitive development, making him unable to communicate properly. Attributed to unknown factors were these problems due to the lack of understanding of genetics at that time, and the community did not associate these difficulties with a common marriage practice among close relatives. Gradually, the physical impact of marriages between cousins was becoming clear. Similar health problems began to be had by children and grandchildren of the first couples, such as more pronounced facial deformities, difficulty in mobility, severe cognitive disabilities, and even heart disease. However, the practice of marriage between family members continued largely due to the lack of external options and the stigma that involved deviation from the community standard. Marriages within the family were repeated in the following years. John Kellogg, Ezekiel's nephew and son of James, married his first cousin, Mary Kellogg, in 1850. Considered by the community as acceptable and even necessary was this marriage, like the previous ones. The same health problems observed in previous generations, including microcephaly, movement difficulties, and facial anomalies, were had by several children of the couple, many of whom were born with. The practice continued to be considered a necessity in the small community, but the physical consequences of such unions began to become increasingly evident. The emotional impact was also deep. Many family members have begun to live on the fringes of society, unable to connect with others and often victims of isolation. Palpable were the shame and stigma around malformations and cognitive deficiency. However, these feelings of guilt and shame were often drowned out by the insistence of keeping the family united and strong according to community traditions. Over the decades, the wedding cycle between cousins and close relatives in the Kellogg family has remained. A new generation of descendants came together within the same lineage in 1880, and once again, the consequences were devastating. William Kellogg, son of John and Mary, married his aunt, Eliza Kellogg, leading to the creation of a new generation of individuals with severe physical and mental disabilities. These weddings were no longer questioned within the family. For the Kelloggs, it was a common and even expected practice. Non-existent was knowledge about genetics and the risks of consanguinity, and health difficulties were for many attributed to bad luck. However, with the increase in deformities and diseases, the family began to be seen with more distance from neighboring communities. The lack of medical and social support led to a worsening of the physical and emotional conditions of family members as isolation intensified. The history of the Kellogg family for many years was treated as an isolated and hidden case. The true extension of the consequences of consanguinity was beginning to be understood only in the early 20th century with the advent of new genetic research. The continuous practice of marriages between relatives was revealed in 1920 by the few surviving members of the family seeking help outside the community. Genetics experts, when studying family records, found that observed physical and mental problems were the direct result of the repetition of consanguineous marriages. The history of the Kellogg family was gradually being published in scientific articles over time and was later discussed in consanguinity and genetic studies. However, the local community and many family members who were still alive continued to live with the weight of shame, often ignoring the truth about their lineage. Something deep about the consequences of ignorance and social isolation is taught to us by the Kellogg family legacy. A legacy of social isolation and shame that lasted for generations was created by the family consanguinity cycle, which not only resulted in physical deformities. The stigma associated with these practices has led many to hide their history not out of evil but for a need to protect their identity and dignity. As we begin to understand the consequences of consanguinity, the reflection on our own social standards becomes inevitable. What stories are being hidden from us today? How many families live in secret with similar stories not yet revealed to the world? What does this say about human nature and our tendency to protect what is easier to ignore? Comment now if you also feel the weight of this story. Not all families deserve to be forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this which need to be heard and understood. The history of the Whittaker family emerged from the shadows in a small town in Western Virginia where isolation and generations of consanguinity intertwine, bringing out the devastating effects of a lack of information on genetics. For years, the secret was maintained with family members living on the fringes of society, carrying a stigma that should never have been carried. Extreme consequences leaving an indelible mark in subsequent generations would be led to by what started with weddings between close cousins and the repetition of ancestral practices. Not only about the Whittaker family but about how isolation and ignorance can transform lives and perpetuate suffering for several generations is the following story. The history of the Whittaker family dates back to the 1800s when the first generations of this lineage settled in Western Virginia, an isolated and difficult region to access. Predominantly farmers who lived in a small community where social relations were limited were the family members. The only viable option for preserving the family name and maintenance of properties became marriages between family members due to the lack of access to formal education and the distance from urban centers. The first case of family incest occurred in the late 1800s when Edward Whittaker, a young family member, married his first cousin, Margaret Whittaker. The union was considered acceptable within the community since both were children of branches close to the same family tree, and the marriage between cousins was not uncommon in isolated families where the population was small and the options to form new limited alliances. There was no deep understanding of the genetic implications that this could cause, although the decision to marry was voluntary. Edward and Margaret, like many others in the community, were not aware of the risks that consanguinity would imply. A matter of convenience and tradition, not scientific knowledge, was marriage for them. There were no widely accessible studies on the risks of incest and its consequences for the health of the descendants at the time. Ray Whittaker was born in 1890, the couple's first child. A rare condition characterized by abnormal development of the brain which caused serious cognitive deficiencies was the severe microcephaly he had. In addition, Ray faced significant motor difficulties, unable to walk without help and presenting a deep mental delay. These symptoms were not immediately attributed to consanguinity. But over time, it was clear that serious genetic problems had been given rise to by the repetition of marriages between cousins and close relatives. Ray was just the first of many descendants of the Whittaker family to face the consequences of generations of consanguinity. Your physical and mental condition not only affected its quality of life but also stigmatized it before society, leading the family to live in even deeper isolation. The lives of other family members who were repeating the same standards and suffering the same physical and emotional consequences were shaped by the difficulties that RY faced. So intense was the shame and stigma associated with Ray's condition that for many years the family was avoided by other inhabitants of the region who did not understand the causes of the health problems that affected the Whittaker lineage. This stigma perpetuated for generations, with the family being increasingly isolated from society, incapable of forming relationships with other members of the community. The history of the Whittaker family was brought to the greater public only in 2004 when filmmaker Mark Laita, known for documenting the stories of marginalized people, visited the family to record its reality. A documentary that exposed the living conditions of the Whittakers, revealing to the world the devastating effects of consanguinity in an isolated lineage, was filmed by Laita. The genetic issues that affected the Whittakers were brought to light by Laita's documentary *Soft White Underbelly*, which not only exposed the harsh reality of the family. A turning point for the public understanding of the effects of consanguinity was the film, to show clearly how choices made in past generations continue to impact the physical and mental health of future generations. Massive was the repercussion of the documentary, generating a wave of discussions about the genetic risks of consanguinity, especially in isolated communities. The story also raised crucial questions about the lack of education and awareness about genetic effects in the small rural communities of the United States, although many watched the documentary with shock and compassion. A milestone in the discussion about consanguinity and its consequences for health was the case of the Whittaker family. Mark Laita's documentary not only exposed the genetic and social problems faced by the family but also questioned how a lack of genetic information and social insulation can result in practices that, without scientific knowledge, are devastating to the health of future generations. The need for genetic education and public policies to prevent consanguinity practices in isolated communities where access to information is limited was brought to light by the case. The discussion about the social impact of consanguinity also expanded, with experts stating that it is essential to offer educational resources and awareness for these populations so that they can make informed choices about their relationships. In addition, deep was the emotional impact of the story, not just for the members of the Whittaker family but for the entire community that watched the documentary. A recurring theme in the discussions after the film screening was the shame, the isolation, and the lack of psychological support for those involved. The discovery that several members of the Whittaker family had tried to move away from the lineage and seek new paths, but due to isolation and a lack of opportunities, they ended up returning to the cycle of consanguinity was one of the most amazing revelations of Laita's documentary. Many of the family's latest descendants were aware of the implications of their history and sought help. But in many cases, help was not enough as the genetic consequences were so deep. A deep reflection on how choices made by one generation can affect future ones, especially when the knowledge and the resources needed to understand these choices are not accessible, is led to by the history of the Whittaker family. A practice that arose from need and ignorance was the repetition of incest in the family, not an act of malice or force, and its consequences were devastating. The weight of a legacy they have not chosen continues to be carried by the stigma, the shame, and the physical and emotional consequences that continue to haunt younger generations. In the end, a warning about the dangers of isolation and a lack of education on genetics and public health is the history of the Whittaker family. She teaches us that as a society, we have the responsibility to educate and inform communities to prevent practices like consanguinity from resulting in such deep tragedies. Comment now if you also feel the weight of this story. What happens when the love between relatives becomes fatal? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this which need to be heard. One of the most tragic examples of consanguinity and how it can profoundly affect the physical, mental, and emotional health of a lineage is the case of the Whittaker family. A reflection on the impact of isolation, society, and a lack of education on genetics in the most remote communities was provoked by the story, which was brought to light by Mark Laita, not only revealing the consequences of consanguinity. We can better understand the challenges that many communities face and work to prevent these tragedies from repeating when learning from these stories. Not just a matter of stigma but also of institutional marginalization was the social rejection of families affected by consanguinity. For a long time, the Whittaker families were avoided by their neighbors and even by members of other families. The reason was clear. A curse, something the community preferred to ignore or not accept, was how cognitive difficulties and genetic malformations were seen. In a testimonial from a former neighbor, Martha Jennings, she reveals how the perception of the community about the Whittaker family has always been negative. I remember when we were children and heard stories about the Whittaker family. Everyone talked in whispers about what was happening in that house. Nobody wanted to approach. No one wanted to interact. People talked about how the children from there were disfigured and were not normal. We could not accept someone like this in our home. It was almost like a punishment to have any kind of contact with them. A deep mark in the psyche of the members of the Whittaker family was left by this type of social marginalization, as they were rejected not only by people but also by the health and education system. They lived on the sidelines, with difficulties to obtain appropriate medical care, and their education was neglected, as many of the family members were not considered able to attend conventional schools due to their cognitive limitations. The situation of all involved was only aggravated by the lack of social support, which made them live in progressive isolation. In isolation have learned to survive consanguineous families such as the Whittakers. A constant battle to maintain their survival was the daily life of these families without the support of the outside world and with extremely limited resources. Even more difficult to live with quality of life was made by the lack of access to information on public health, education, or even psychological support. In the case of the Whittakers, in addition to the physical and psychological difficulty, there was also the challenge of maintaining dignity in a society that saw them as anomalous. For many family members, their lives were spent trying to live like the others, but always with the weight of a stigma that accompanied them wherever they were. A deep sense of inadequacy and lack of belonging, feelings shared by many members of the lineage, was generated by this. A rare window to their lives was provided by Mark Laita's documentary, allowing the world to know how deep the social isolation lived by the Whittaker family was. Laita, in an interview, commented on the experience of filming the family. The most impressive for me was the way they were in total imprisonment but at the same time communicated with each other in a very intimate way. There was a fortress in the way they protected themselves, but at the same time, immense fragility in how they faced the world outside. It was a great privilege to document this reality but at the same time a great responsibility. How much ignorance and stigma can determine the fate of a person or a family is the deepest reflection generated by this case. Crucial questions about how society deals with the excluded and how we can change our approach to ensure that more people do not go through this kind of suffering are raised by what happened to the Whittaker family. In the heart of the east of Kentucky mountains, a peculiar and rare story of consanguinity and a genetic condition almost forgotten by time took shape. For generations, a family was marked by the blue color of its skin, a characteristic that would make them known as the Blue Family of Troublesome Creek. Initially misunderstood and stigmatized was the condition which would intrigue scientists and doctors. But how this lineage began and what impact the choices of their ancestors had on the next generations. A complex problem of consanguinity that would generate devastating consequences was revealed in reality by what seemed like a simple genetic phenomenon. What happens when science and history intersect? How a lineage that began with a common practice at the time, marriage between relatives, resulted in such a visible and impactful condition. This is the Fugate family report. A blue blood history in which the color of his skin was not the only thing that differentiated them from the rest of society. The history of the Fugate family dates back to the 19th century, more precisely to the year 1820 when pioneers Martin Fugate and Elizabeth Smart settled in Troublesome Creek, an isolated region in the hills of Kentucky. Martin Fugate, a man of French origin, and Elizabeth of English ancestry, were destined to form a lineage marked by a rare genetic phenomenon. What seemed to be a simple union between two members of local families would soon become the beginning of a cycle of weddings between close relatives. The first marriage between Martin and Elizabeth Fugate was not uncommon for the time, especially in isolated communities where wedding options were limited. Weddings between cousins and close relatives were acceptable and common in rural communities without many other couples available. What Martin and Elizabeth didn't know was that their union would give rise to a recessive gene, methemoglobinemia, which would begin to be transmitted from generation to generation, changing dramatically the life of the descendants. The phenomenon that would make the Fugate family stand out and be known as the Blue family was a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia, which prevented the blood from oxygenating properly. This resulted in bluish skin because the blood had difficulty transporting oxygen to the body's cells. When the descendants of Martin and Elizabeth were born, many exhibited the visible feature of bluish skin, which for many was the first sign that something unusual was happening with this lineage. Methemoglobinemia occurs due to a mutation of the gene responsible for hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in the blood. In its most common form, the gene for this condition is recessive, which means that for a person to present the condition, she must inherit a copy of the gene from each parent. The rare condition did with that the skin of the Fugate family members became visibly bluish, especially when they were in natural light, a feature that soon became a marker of his family identity. With the passing of generations, the phenomenon of blue skin became a characteristic of the family lineage, with children being born with the condition due to the persistent practice of consanguineous marriages. Each generation continued to perpetuate this recessive gene until the condition spread through several generations, creating a lineage with visible and hereditary effects. Although the condition was a medical and biological curiosity, what perpetuated it was the marriages between relatives throughout generations, including the descendants of Martin and Elizabeth. Like many other weddings of the time, the wedding options were limited in isolated areas, and the practice of marrying close relatives was a way to maintain the properties and family ties. A large number of children who suffered from the condition resulted from the first generation of methemoglobinemia among the Fugates. Marriages between close relatives, such as first cousins, continued over the years, perpetuating the methemoglobinemia gene. Although the consequences of consanguinity were not fully understood at the time, the marriage between Martin and Elizabeth was the first step in a long cycle that would last more than a century. This perpetuation was contributed to by the lack of marriage alternatives outside the community and the geographical isolation of families, with the genetic condition manifesting more and more with each generation. At first, there was no perception that the condition was directly linked to the practice of consanguinity. For the Fugates, the blue skin was simply a family feature, and the following generations did not fully understand the consequences of the genetics involved. The stigma, however, was beginning to take shape as the condition spread to more family members. As the recessive gene was transmitted from generation to generation, the condition of the blue skin manifested in various ways. Although methemoglobinemia itself was not fatal, it caused health difficulties, especially in extreme situations of a lack of oxygenation and increased susceptibility to lung diseases. In addition, a social stigma that the Fugate family members had to support over the years was generated by the physical condition. Throughout the generations, the Fugate family began to be seen as a curiosity, but also with a look of revulsion and fear. The surrounding population, upon realizing the peculiar color of the skin of family members, began to push them away. Just one of the difficulties faced by the Fugates was the stigma of being different. Beyond physical questions, the Fugates also faced emotional and psychological problems due to the social isolation and the discrimination they have suffered. The family was treated with distrust, being marginalized and stigmatized by something they could not control. It was only in the 20th century, when the Fugate family descendants began to expand to areas besides Troublesome Creek, that the true impact of methemoglobinemia and its relationship with consanguinity began to be understood. At the time, doctors and geneticists began to study the case of the family and recognized that the condition was perpetuated due to the continuous practice of consanguineous marriages. An important reference for scientific studies on consanguinity and the genetic effects of methemoglobinemia became the history of the Fugate family. From the 1940s, with the work of geneticists who studied the Fugates, the concept of recessive genetic conditions began to be more widely understood. Methemoglobinemia was identified as a very rare condition which results from the mutation of a specific gene and was associated with consanguinity. This case, together with other investigations into genetic diseases in isolated communities, led to a greater debate on the effects of consanguinity on physical health. A series of questions about how practices such as consanguineous marriages can result in rare genetic conditions and how they affect human development were generated by the research on the case of the Fugates. Studies on human genetics began to grow in importance, and the idea of avoiding such practices became a concern in society. What started as an isolated case of bluish skin transformed into an important study on the effects of consanguinity on human health. However, the most surprising was the legacy that this study left not only for the scientific community but also for society in general. The public revelation on the condition and social implications led to the formation of a new public awareness of inherited genetic conditions, and the Fugates became a reference when discussing the relationship between consanguinity and genetic health. A clear example of how past errors, choices made by generations without understanding genetic effects, can impact the following generations in deep ways is the history of the Fugate family. A warning about the need for genetic education and how isolated communities without the proper knowledge may perpetuate diseases that could be avoided is the case of the Fugates. Today, the Fugate family legacy is not just an example of the consequences of consanguinity but also an alert to the modern world about the importance of education and genetic consciousness. Important questions about social isolation, stigma, and the perpetuation of genetic diseases that are still relevant were raised by the study of their